So talking you through refugee status, I wanted to say to you that here I've put a link. So if you don't know much about it, or you're an asylum seeker and you're not sure where to go to or what to do, then I've given you a link to be able to find out more about the visas and immigration website, and it'll give you more detail on there. Next slide, please. Sorry, Siobhan, it's not moving. Okay, that's great, thanks. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to talk to you about the actual residency categories. A lot of people just tell me, oh, I'm an asylum seeker, or a practitioner will just say, oh, she's an asylum seeker and she's looking to see what funding she's going to get. Unfortunately, asylum seeker isn't a residency category for you to be able to enable you to get higher education funding from the student loans company. You need to do an application to be an asylum seeker, and that leads you to a category. And one of those categories will be one of these listed here. One is indefinite leave to enter or remain. Otherwise, you'll have refugee status, humanitarian protection, indefinite leave to remain as a domestic violence, indefinite leave to remain as a bereaved partner, the stateless person, Section 67 or Calais leave to remain, the Afghan ones, which I've put there, and I will talk you through those ones more specifically a bit later, is the ARAP, A-R-A-P, and ACRS, which is pitting. These are the words that are being used, but I will explain them all the way through. The Ukraine scheme to leave, which came out last year as well, which I will talk through. And then if you don't fit into some of those categories, you might fit into something called long residency, which I will talk through as well. Next slide, please. So as I said, if you're an asylum seeker, you won't be able to get funding from the student loans company. But what I have done there, if you see under the first paragraph, is to see what's called sanctuary scholarships, because people, universities are signing up to something to be able to give sanctuary to students who are asylum seekers. And that means that they're helping them out with funding for their tuition fees and providing them with maintenance. That doesn't stop you applying for one of the categories as a refugee or any of the categories that I just talked through. It basically means that the universities will give you funding to get you started and to get you through that, but you can still apply for a refugee status. Now, once you apply for the asylum seekers and you've been considered, your application's gone through and you're applying for the refugee status and you've then got your refugee status, you will be given something called refugee leave to remain, LTR, or refugee indefinite leave to remain, ILR. All right. So once you've been granted this, a refugee status, then you are entitled to be able to apply for funding immediately. You don't have to wait for residency for 3 years or anything like that. You get an automatic, you are now deemed as an ordinary resident. So let's say you get your refugee status on, I don't know, let's say the 5th of June, and you're starting university in September, and as long as you've not left the country and you've stayed in the United Kingdom, then you've got ordinary residency from the day you got your refugee status. So you can start in September and you will be given funding from the student loans company. However, I will tell you that you will need to apply for student funding in a timely manner for you to be able to get your funding in time. So I will talk to you through that when I get to talking about student funding. Next slide, please. Now, stepchildren and children, this is another area. So if your parents have decided that they applied through asylum seekers to become a refugee, then automatically children will be included or should be on the application when they're going through. But if you're under 18, you should have been on that application, and therefore you would get refugee status through your parents. However, if you're over 18, you wouldn't be able to be on that, because in England or in Britain, we deem you as being an adult, and therefore you need to apply for this status in your own right. Now, Once you've applied for this status and you've got it, then basically you would need to provide evidence to us. So if you were under 18, you would need to provide evidence of your asylum application, that your name was on that asylum application, and your relationship to your parents. So that would be what you would need to provide. Your parents would then need to provide something different. They would need to provide the documentation that had confirmed that they'd been granted refugee status and that your name was on their application to be able to go through. And then automatically you'd be given ordinary residency. However, if you're over the age of 18, then you would need to apply for this category's refugee status in your own right. Next slide, please. Now, if you're a spouse, you're married or you've got a civil partnership with a refugee, and basically you're applying through them, then again, you would need to provide documentation, and we would need to see your own valid identity and your marriage certificate or your certificate to show that you're in a civil partnership. Your spouse or civil partner would also need to provide some information, and they'd need to provide the documentation that granted them refugee status and the Home Office letter showing that the application for asylum, basically. Now, if you haven't been granted this, basically, this refugee status, and you've started the course, so let's say you've started a higher education course under the Sanctuary Scholarship, for instance, and you now you're applying for your refugee status and you're halfway through the year, you'll get refugee status from the Home Office. That automatically gives you the right to be able to apply for funding from us. And in fact, in one of the scenarios I go through, I'll show you how that works. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk through humanitarian protection. Next slide, please. And the same with humanitarian protection. Basically, if you've been granted humanitarian protection, on the first day you get that, you've got ordinary residency, which means you're entitled to the same status as everybody else who's been in Britain, is able to apply for benefits. You can apply for student funding and you're deemed as ordinary residents on that first day. Now, once you've been given that status, that's fine, you're okay, but there is another status that says humanitarian in it, which means that you may not get humanitarian, you won't come under the humanitarian protection status. So sometimes you're given evidence that states you've got discretionary leave due to humanitarian reasons. Now, we wouldn't give that to you because that's not a category for us to be able to give you funding, but you would be able to look at another area. So let's say you've lived in this country for an awfully long time, then you might be able to go under something like the long residency route, which I will talk to you about and what you need to then provide in the next few slides. So I've put a question there. I have limited leave to remain. Can I still apply for student funding? Well, limited leave to remain for student support under the regulations as it stands at the moment, you don't, but you could look at long residency. And again, that's another way of me being able to help support you. So I'll show you some of that long residency and what evidence we need for you to be able to apply under that route. Next slide, please.